Okay, good morning, everyone. We'll wait. I think people are popping on, so we'll wait a few minutes so everybody can make sure that they are on. We've got a big group this morning in regards to the session. So welcome to the 2020 virtual Great Lakes Games. And many of you have heard me say this over and over, especially those of you that have been on other sessions, but the weather is absolutely gorgeous. It's sunny and warm and no rain and no snow. So unfortunately, we're in the virtual mode. So today's session is 101 para track and field rules. So I guess it gives us an opportunity, even though we're not competing, all of us to go over the rules. So I guess that's a good thing. I'd like to thank our sponsors, which are up and for supporting our virtual games, and looking forward to 2021 in live. So before I introduce our moderator, we have a few housekeeping items that I'll go over. In order to avoid the background noise, all attendees have been muted. And if you have questions for the panelists, make sure that you put them in the Q&A button rather than the chat. And a little bit different, if you've been on other sessions, that we are going to be going over the questions as they come instead of waiting to the very end. So if there are questions that are specific to your athlete, we can provide contact information. So we're looking at questions that are for the good of the group. We also have Melissa, our intern, manning the chat function, and love to know who you are. So feel free to shout out on the chat. And when you do that, make sure that that it's sent to both the panelists and the attendees. And so again, feel free to introduce yourself. Today's moderator is Dave Bogenschutz, and Dave leads up our GLASA track and field program. So I will let Dave introduce our speakers today, Phil and Jerry. So Dave, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to see that you were able to join us this morning. We have a large group. For those of you that don't know our presenters today, I don't know why you would or wouldn't. They've been, if you've been to any meets anytime in the last several years, you know that they're like joined at the hip. They're always together, and they know the rules inside and out. So I think that you're going to get very good updated information on rule changes. And if you've got questions, like Cindy said, please throw them out, because they know how to answer them accurately. And if they don't, they will get back to you with the correct answer. So first, I'd like to introduce Phil Galley. Phil Galley is presently, and has been for a while, the chairman of Adapted Track and Field USA. He is also a para-certified official, and you see him he's in high demand, and you see him at a lot of the meets that are national. So, and then his sidekick is Jerry Clayton. He's the vice chair of Adapted Track and Field USA. And Jerry used to be a nice US para certified official, but he's decided to go on to bigger and better things. So he is an international technical official and educator for World Para Athletics. And he's been doing this for several years. He has a lot of travel behind him, and he is really, really knowledgeable about the rules and their interpretation. So with that, I turn this over to Phil and to Jerry. Have a great time, guys.
Okay. Can you can you all see the screen?
Not yet.
Okay, let me share it then. Now you can?
I'm losing you.
Nope.
Uh-huh. Now?
Looks like it's coming. There we go.
Okay, here we go. All right, so I'm glad that we're all together today. Jerry and I have given this presentation many, many times over the past 8 years, and so we constantly update it to the current rules. And the way we're going to take it on today is I will do the beginning slides and track, and then Jerry will take over to do field. So that's the way it'll go. It'll take us about an hour and 15 minutes to get through this. So our planned closing time is 12:15. So we should be in good shape. At any time you have a question for us, just jot it down or chime in, and we'll see if we can answer it as we go, because it'll probably be easier. Okay, so so World Para Athletics controls the rules for track and field. All the rules come down from the International AAF World Track Organization, and now it comes down to World Para Athletics. And in the United States, it would come down to, for the able-bodied runners, it would come down to USATF. Okay. The rule books that we're following and that you can look up online are the World Para Rules and Regulations and Adaptive Track and Field USA rules. You can find both of these either by going to you can find the World Para Athletics by going to worldparaathletics.org, or you can go to adaptivetrackandfield.org. So it's ATFUSA.org, and under rules, you'll have a hyperlink to the Paralympic rules on World Para Athletics or our rules for the United States. Okay, we are governed by classification, as you all know. So athletes who compete in para athletics, track and field, will compete within their class. And we'll go through those classes right now so that everyone, if you're not familiar with them, will understand them. And if you are familiar with them, it'll be a review. So we have the blind, and the blinds are classes 11, 12, and 13. We have the intellectually impaired T20s. We have the cerebral palsy brain injury athletes who are 31 through 38. We have the individuals of short stature, which are 40 and 41. And we have those with a lower limb deficiency, which are 40 that are not amputees, are 42, 43, and 44. And those that are amputees, 2 years ago, we changed and created the class of 61, 62, 63, and 64. So, those are class. So now we've separated those. So if you've been competing before 2 years ago, then the 42 through 44 were including the amps, and now we've separated them out. So when we did separate them out for a junior perspective, if you set a record and you were an amputee, that record moved over to the 61 through 64 class. And if you had set it as a 42 through 44, then it still remains up on the website. If not, if it was owned by, if a 42 through 44 record was owned by an amputee, then those records were vacated and they're being populated again in 18 and 19, and would have been populated in 20. If you have a disability, an upper limb disability, you would be class 45, 46, or 47. So you can see those on the screen now. And I will not go through them because we want to concentrate on the rules. So this is really an overview. But this presentation, again, is on adaptivetrackandfieldusa.org. So atfusa.org. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see Officials Corner. And if you click on that, in that page, you'll see the course that you can click on, and then this presentation will come up. And at the end of the presentation, if you're an official, you can click on it and take the test.
I will say, if you don't mind me interrupting, Phil, that understanding the classification system is kind of important as an official, because as you'll see later on, understanding the difference between a 50 and a 44 or a 62 bears on some of the nuances to the rules that are unique to parasport.
Correct. Thanks, Chair. Okay, and then the 50 classes are wheelchairs with spinal cord injury or spina bifida, or a combination of the two. And on the track, it's 51 through 54, and in the field, it's 51 through 57. So wheelchair or seated classes are 31, 32, 33, 34, 51 through 54, and throwing are 31, 32, 33, 34, 51 through 54, and then for throwing, there are 31, 32, 33, 34, 51 through 54, 57, excuse me. And ambulatory are T11, 12, and 13, T20, 35 through 38, T40 and 41, 42 through 44, 61 through 64, and then 45, 46, and 47 for the upper. Throwing is the same, it's 35, 36, 37, 38, and it's really the same as jumps and track. Okay, so age groups. So we compete first by sex, male and female, and then we compete by class, which we just went over. And the third thing we compete again is by age groups. So for World Para Athletics, we have age groups U17, U20, the Open, which is age 14 and older, and the Masters group, which is 35 and older. For the United States, we have Adaptive Track and Field USA controls the age groups U11, U14, our age group, which is U23, which is athletes who are 20 and 20, 21, and 22, and the Masters group, Masters 35, Masters 50, and Masters 60. Okay. To compete for these age groups, you have to, for the Masters, it's your age on the day of competition. And for all the other age groups, both for World Para Athletics and for Adaptive Track and Field USA, it's your age as of December 31st of the year you're competing, which is sometimes confusing, but we have gotten a few people who have gotten to junior nationals and they say, well, I'm 14, and we tell them, no, they're 15. So it's your age as of December 31st. Okay, so are there any questions before we go any further on general overview of classification and age groups and rules, where you can find them? Okay, if you do, just chime in. So the first thing I want to go through from a rules perspective is protests. So if you're a athlete or a coach, and you feel that you have been disserviced in the competition area, you have the right to protest. If you are competing and you get a disqualification, a potential disqualification prior to your competing, you have the right to say that you would like to compete under protest. So we would encourage you to compete under protest. And then this way, that if that protest was overturned after the event is over, then your competition would count. If you were to just abide by the protest and not compete, then obviously you've missed that event. So we would encourage you to take it upon yourself to say, Mr. Fischel, I'd like to compete under protest until we resolve this issue. And then we will go through that. The other thing that happens is, that we have a issue with the right to use video. So if you protest and you have additional information, you have the right to bring that to the group. So we need to, so you can bring that to the official. So this is the way you should protest. So the first thing that happens is you have a disqualification or an issue with respect to the event. The second thing you do is you go to the ref and you ask for an explanation, and you see if you can't resolve that issue prior to protesting. If in fact you can resolve it, then there's no reason to protest. If you feel that the official thinks that disqualification should stand, then you would get a protest form from the officials and then fill out that protest form. Let me tell you that you can only protest against a rule. So when you write up your protest form, you have to write the rule number. And we'll be more than happy to, at any event, give you a rule book or explain where that rule is so that you can protest that rule. But Jerry, do you have any other comment about protesting?
No, I mean, that was very succinct and well said. Again, like Phil indicated, it is absolutely necessary to base your protest on a particular rule. At the international level, if the rule's not there, the form is pretty much put in the trash can.
Yeah.
You know, it's a responsibility of the coaches, the team leaders, and eventually the athlete to make sure those things are filled out appropriately and in a timely manner. There's certain time requirements after results are posted that if you have a protest, you have to submit that. Typically it's 30 minutes.
Right. So we will at a normal meet, we will generate the results of that event, post it, and there should be a time on that sheet if it's being done properly. And you have 30 minutes from the time it's put up until to protest that event. Most of the time, you should be able to resolve the issue by talking to the ref and work it out and understand. But again, if you have additional information, say that you've caught something on video, then please bring it along, and that could aid your defense. Okay. All right. So
and of course, you still have the right for an oral protest.
Yeah.
Immediately, you know, if you're in the cage and you throw something and the official says, well, that was out of the sector, and you don't believe it was out of the sector, you can protest, and the referee may or may not decide to allow you to compete under protest, and they'll consider that afterwards, like Phil had indicated earlier.
Okay, so now relays. Last year we expanded the relay zone, the exchange zones. Before we had a tag zone and we had an acceleration zone. The tag zone was 20 meters and the acceleration zone was 10 meters, and they're marked on most, I think, every track that way. We changed that rule because of the relays in Rio, in which in both the U.S. Paralympic team, men's, and the U.S. able-bodied team in the Olympics, both disqualified in the third turn. And after that event, those rules were changed. So now we no longer have an acceleration zone. We only have a tag zone. And that tag zone for ambulatory runners is 30 meters long now. It's from the start of the acceleration zone until the end of the tag zone. And for wheelchairs, we now extend that 40 meters. So you cannot set up outside that zone, and you tag yourself within that zone in order to be qualified. A tag is not where the person is, but the tag is where the tag actually happens. So you could have a person coming into the tag zone with his hand extended and be into the tag zone and have a legitimate tag, even though that person's body is outside. Okay. All right, lane violations. So lane violations are pretty clear. In a straightaway, as long as you do not impede another athlete, you can stray left or right, inside or outside your lane, and you will not generally be disqualified for that event. However, in the curve, you can go, if you go inside your line, then that is a disqualification because you're actually shortening the course. So I always say that the, excuse me, the inside line of an athlete to his left belongs to the official. The outside line, the outside white line of that particular lane, all of it belongs to the athlete. So, so you cannot touch the inside line at all in a curve, but you can touch the outside line in a curve as much as you want, or you could extend out. If you started in lane 1, theoretically you could go to lane 8 and come back in and still not be disqualified because you're actually making the course longer and not shorter. Okay. The other thing is that the other thing is the MASH. So we're going to talk about MASH. So MASH is for amputees. It's the maximum allowable standing height. It's a it can't be exceeded, and when it comes out to be, in layman's terms, which is the way I like to talk about it, an athlete is measured to the height that they would be if they had had legs, right? If you had normal legs and you were supposed to be 5'8", then you cannot have prosthetics that are going to make you 6'2". And we've gone through that. Now that's constantly under review, and there are different feelings from officials about whether or not to do away with that, but that's the way it is today. So we have no, you cannot be taller than your MASH height, and that is measured in the call tent. When you get in the call tent, you have a MASH number. It's been given to you by the classifiers. The officials in the call tent will ask you to stand next to a measuring device, and you'll be measured to see if you're shorter than or equal to your MASH height. Okay, relays.
Hey, Phil?
Yes, go ahead.
Phil, just a fine point on that. It's for double amputees.
Yeah.
And the measurement of the MASH for those guys has to occur every time they go to a different event coming through the call room, not just once at the beginning of the day.
Correct. Okay, so now, so for relays, batons are used or not used, right? So batons are used for all T11, T12, T13, T20, T35 through 38 relay races, but they are not used for wheelchair relays or for T42 or T60 athletes. So the exchange is done by touch for those athletes and by baton for the other athletes. World Power, we'll cover this later, but World Power Athletic has a universal relay, which is the only relay that you'll find at the international level. And it has to have 2 men and 2 women. And there are rules on what can configure that relay. So the first leg has to be a T11, T12, or T13. Second has to be T42 through 47 or 61 through 64. The third leg has to be T35 through 38. And the fourth leg has to be a wheelchair, 33, 34, or 51 through 54. So, but you can't have a maximum, you can only have a maximum of 2 athletes that are 13, 46, 47, 38, or 54. So it's a complicated mix, but it makes for an exciting event. So that's what we'll do. The visually impaired athletes and wheelchair athletes have 2 lanes to compete in. And that's obviously because visual impaired athletes sometimes have guides, and wheelchairs pretty hard to exchange in a normal 1-lane event. So, okay. All right, so mixed competitions, mixed events between male and female. Normally, sometimes you ask a question if you're an athlete. Well, there's not very many people at this event, so why can't I combine male and female in this event? Well, it's a rule by World Power Athletics that we can't do that. We can combine male and female in races in the United States to 3,000 and higher, and in the international events, the 5,000 meter and higher. So in those events, if we have a shortage of individuals to have 2 heats, we can combine them into 1 heat. Sometimes we will combine at the shorter races, but it's very, very frowned upon. And unless it's a dire situation where we're expecting rain or we have another issue, we'll honor the rule of keeping males and females separate in that case. Okay. Clothing. You can read the rules on clothing. We don't hold to those clothing rules very much in our local meets in the United States, but they have to be clean and designed to be worn and not objectionable. Obviously, you cannot obviously have curse words on them. We would frown against that. And in the case of seated throws, they cannot be so baggy that we cannot see if you're a seated thrower that you're lifting. Shoes are discussed in the rule books, and the number of spikes in a shoe cannot exceed 11, and the length of those spikes in those shoes are governed by the rules in the rule book, and also sometimes governed by the track facility that you're going to be competing in. All right, bib numbers.
Bill.
Yes, sir.
Fine point.
Yeah.
The shoe can't have more than 11 places for a spike on it.
Yeah. Correct. So it's here, right here. Okay. And okay. And bib numbers. So bib numbers on ambulatory athletes should be worn on the front and the back. And on wheelchairs, they should be worn on the back of the chair. And for most meets, if we have cameras, we want the other bib number to be on the side of the frame facing the camera. So if the camera is on the inside, it should be on the left. And if the camera is on the outside of the track, it would be on the right. All right, prosthetics, 61 through 64 athletes must compete the event with their prosthetic for running events and horizontal jumps. And they're optional in field events, right? So for high jump, it's optional to wear it or not wear it. We'll cover the detail rules in a few minutes. For 47 through 50, 45 through 47, you have the option of wearing a prosthetic. And for And for 61 and 62, you're obviously your prosthetics can exceed the allowable standing height, the MASH number. For 42, for 44, your orthotics are optional. IMAS for your blind athletes. You know, prior to Rio, we only asked blind athletes to wear a mask. Post Rio, we ask athletes to wear gauze over their eyes and a mask. And we had some issues in Rio and before where athletes who were T11s were not totally blind and were accused of being able to see. So this way we're wearing gauze, we'll be able to protect and make sure everyone is competing the same. In track, you have to wear your gauze and your mask all the time. And in field, if you're competing, you have to have the mask and the gauze. If you're not competing, you have to wear the gauze, but not the mask. You can take the mask off, but you still have to have the gauze on while you're waiting. Helmet rule for frame running or for wheelchairs, you have to have a helmet from the time you enter the venue until the time you leave. You need to wear your helmet. Okay, in the United States, we're more strict than I think at international meets, but for the United States, when you enter the venue, we want your helmet on because we don't want anyone to have a concussion injury. For those athletes that are T11 or possibly T12 athletes that are using guides, you must use a tether. That tether has to be, the new rules on tether has to be 30 centimeters long. And there's a picture of it on the screen. So that's the way we govern it. If you're doing a road race, that tether can be extended to 50 centimeters. You have to have it worn in your hand. You can't have it on your arm. For one athlete, for the guide, and the other have it on their hand. Both of them have to be holding it in their hand.
Phil, it's important that the guide and the athlete only hold that tether by the loop. They can't grab the stopper and shorten the length of the tether by doing it that way. We see people doing that from time to time.
Correct. Okay. And you have to hold on to that tether from the time the gun goes off until both the athlete and the guide has crossed the finish line. Only official medical staff appointed by the LOC or the T medical staff approved by the LOC and the TD are allowed to treat competitors in the competition area. So if you get injured, we try to be accommodating in the United States, obviously at all our meets, and we will possibly call in a coach to help if we find that there's an issue. However, that time being the issue here, we can't let that injury delay the event. The same way you can't allow a flat tire on a racing chair to delay event, although we are, for the most part, we do give you as much time as we possibly can to fix whatever it is that's wrong. Possession or use of communication devices is not allowed. So at international events, you can't bring, or well, theoretically, or at our community or local or regional events, you should not bring communication devices into the venue. They should be put away and turned off. So you cannot have devices that are communicating outside of the venue with your coach or anyone else. Okay. We do obviously allow your athletes to talk, to your coaches. And if you're in a field event, you have plenty of time. We set up where that coaching area is. And in an international event, they're usually outside of the fence, and you can go over to talk to them or yell at them during the event, just as a normal event would be in able-bodied track and field. Aides who are in the venue, allowable by the rules to help an athlete. You are an aide and you are not a coach. So we expect those aides to only talk about the weather or talk about other things, but not about the competition. So if we find that you're talking about competition or coaching, we'll give you a warning. And if that goes further, it could mean a disqualification for the athlete. Okay. Okay. Viewing by athletes competing in a field event of images of previous trials recorded on the behalf of the person not placed in competition area, those must not be taken into the competition. What that means is that a coach can be recording your performance inside the competition area, and you can go over to talk to him and he can actually show you that, but you can't bring that into the competition area.
So don't lean over the wall and show it to him.
Yeah.
If you're the coach.
Correct. Okay, so we'll go through quickly the rules and then we'll turn it over to Jerry. So, for visually impaired, T11, T12, and T13, the 11 class has to use a guide. They have to wear the gauze and the mask. T12s can use a guide or not use a guide. Both the 11s and the 12s always have 2 lanes, whether you're using a guide or not using a guide. The class 13 athletes are considered the same as an ambulatory athlete, and they follow all the world athletics rules and regulations. They only have 1 lane and there's no guide allowed.
Hey, Phil, can I make a point about that picture on that slide?
Yeah.
It's an older one.
Yeah.
And if you look at the tether, it looks like the athlete and maybe the guide too has the loop wrapped around their hand, and you see how close their hands are. That would be a DQ in today's rules.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a prior 2016 picture.
Yeah.
We're updating this presentation for the 21 through 24 quad, and obviously these pictures will be changed. Okay, so if you're using a guide, the guide must finish, the athlete must finish the race first, right? So the guide cannot finish the race before the athlete. The guide cannot pull the athlete. We've seen that happen a lot, right? In some cases where the athlete is better than the guide, the actual athlete is pulling the guide. But anyway, that being said, the guide is there to help the athlete maneuver through the course and is not there to make the athlete faster. For events 5,000 meters or longer, the athlete can have 2 guides. You must declare that you're going to have 2 guides prior to the event, and you must use that. If you declare that you're going to use 2 guides, you have to use those 2 guides. You can't decide in the middle of the race not to transition.
Phil?
Yes.
We do have a question.
Sure.
So in field events, are athletes allowed to wear their hearing aids?
Yes, you can wear your hearing aid. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, yeah. We're not stopping anyone to using for anything that's for medical use at all. Okay. Traditionally, where you would transition from one guide to the other guide is on the far side of the track, correct, Jerry?
It has to be.
Yeah, it's in the middle. We would position that guide in the middle of of the straightaway on the far side of the track. And then sometime during the race, you would transition from guide number 1 to guide number 2. Again, if you declare that you're using 2, you have to use 2. Otherwise, the athlete would be disqualified. 4x100 relays. We talked about this, that that's 100 meters each, and we've extended the tag zone now to either be 30 meters or 40 meters. For wheelchairs, it's lanes. They get wheelchairs and frame runners, which is our new term for race runners. And for our blind athletes, have 2 lanes. Those lanes are defined as 1, which includes 1 and 2, 3, which is 3 and 4, 5, which is 5 and 6, and 7, which is 7 and 8. Okay, so when I first got into officiating, an athlete and his guide came to the starting line, and the athlete was in lane 2 and the guide was in lane 1, and they said, well, we're going to set up at the place where the lane 2 would start rather than where lane 1 would start. And their justification was that that since the athlete was in lane 2, then the proper distance for 400 meters in this case would be from the starting line in lane 2, not the starting line in lane 1. That is not the case, however. So no matter where the athlete starts, either on the inner or the outer lane of his pair, he has to be in lane 1, 3, 5, or 7. Okay, batons are used, batons in a relay are used for the VI athletes. The baton can be carried by the guide or the athlete, and the transition between the guide and the athlete can be a guide to an athlete, or an athlete to a guide, or a guide to a guide, or an athlete to an athlete. Doesn't matter how you transition, it's just a matter of that they're being used. We only in the United States, since we're not running them internationally anymore, if you're running a VI relay, then you have to have a minimum of a T11 in that race, and no more than 1 T13 in that race. Let me see. T12s not using a guide may have one assistant to orientate themselves for the start or for the transition. So if you have a T12, you can ask for an aide to help you position where you're supposed to be on the track. Okay. Intellectually impaired athletes, as well as the blind, must use blocks. And this is really we have to change this. It's not a 4-point stance anymore, but you have to use blocks for T11, 12, or 13, and T20 athletes. For all other classes, it's optional. And we have an exception rule in the United States for U14 athletes, in which which you cannot use. You can choose not to use a starting block. We do encourage you for best practices, however, that you should, if you're a coach, you should be training your athlete to use a block as early as possible, because when they do get older, they're going to have to use it, and so they should get used to it. And theoretically, it is a faster start using blocks than it is not using blocks.
You know, it's important to kind of say that the guides, if in evidence, must also use blocks. They can't just kind of stand up in a crouch and run with their athlete off the blocks.
True. Okay. Okay, so if you need an assistance, if a T20, say, needs assistance in setting that block and those blocks up, we have an assistance form. Now at our national meets, we may or may not use the assistance form. You can just go and ask you can ask in the marshalling tent that you need support, and we typically allow the coach to go out and set those blocks up. Or if we're if we have the support on site, then we need to just know how you want those blocks to be set up, and we'll set them up for the athlete. Okay, for CP, stroke, and TBI athletes, which are 31 through 38, we use batons for the 35 through 38 relays, and obviously for the wheelchair relays, we would use touch, right, for that. If you're a starter, then we typically CP or stroke and TBI athletes may not have the ability to stay in one place for a very long period of time. So from a starter's perspective, we do urge you to get them into starting position and start them as quickly as possible so that we don't have an athlete being accused of a disqualification. It is the ability of the starter now to judge whether or not an athlete has been given an advantage by false starting or not. So typically, for a CP athlete, if there is some type of problem at the start, it typically is a case where the athlete is losing his balance and not necessarily gaining an advantage. But it is the ability of the ref or of the head official, the starter, to judge that. Here's a good case of where you may decide to ask the official to run under protest. It's typically where you're going to find an issue is in this case where after looking at the videos, they may agree that in fact you were just losing your balance and not getting an official. So you should assert your privilege of running under protest. One other thing, if you're a starter, typically CP athletes, class 36, have multiple disabilities, and they also may be deaf. So you should, or becoming deaf, hard of hearing. So you should work with the team and know your athletes and be able to start them properly and make sure everyone has a fair start. Okay. Amputees don't require a block start. However, you can use it if you need to. Those blocks you could use, you don't necessarily have to use both blocks. You could use one block of the two. So you could choose to either run without them or run with them, use both, only use one. It's up to the athlete. If you are in track, you must use your prosthetics to run. So if you're running down the track and you lose your prosthetic or it falls off, you do not have to put the prosthetic back on, but you do have to finish the race with the prosthetic. So you may choose to pick up the prosthetic and hop the rest of the way, and that would be a legitimate finish to the race. That's a change in the rules that happened about 2 years ago. Before that time, you had to put your prosthetic back on. We've now changed the rule so that you just have to have it. You just have to carry it across the finish line. You were going to lose anyway, right? So it really didn't make any sense for you to take additional time to place the prosthetic back on. For field, the prosthetic is an option, right? So you need to understand, you either use it or you don't use it. If you use it, however, you must compete with it through the whole trial. Okay. Arm amps may have an issue with one arm being shorter than the other, or so you have the ability to have a pad on the starting line. Those pads have to be neutral in color and not and not have any writing on it, which would determine, which would be political or non-political. So we had a case in the United States when we took our junior team to Ireland. One of our athletes had red, white, and blue on their pad. They were told that they needed to tape over those that national color. We want the race to concentrate on the athlete and not on anything other on the track that's going on. So that's the way the rules are. Okay. Wheelchair specifications. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because we don't have a lot of time. We want to get it over to Jerry. But so you're using a racing wheelchair. It's got normal 3 wheels. 2 back wheels are 700C. Wheels are lower. There are rules on the height of the wheelchair that the wheels in the back cannot extend beyond the back of the chair. And we told you where the bib numbers have to go. Helmet rules are helmet rules. Gloves, as you know, can either be, you can not use a glove, or you can use a glove, and those gloves can be, if you're just starting out, they could be baseball gloves that are taped up, or they can be harness gloves, which are the leather gloves that are being shown here, or they can be molded gloves from a 3D printer. Wheelchair starts or for both wheelchairs and frame runner. So I talked about this before. 2 days ago, Jerry informed me that race runners are now being called frame running. So that's just a change in the name. Everybody has agreed to it. There was some confusion, so they've changed the name. But basically, the front wheel, the axle of the front wheel is the delineating point of the start and the finish of the race. So the wheel, the bottom of the wheel where it touches the ground cannot touch has to be behind the starting line. Okay, so if in the United States we do not, typically for the youth, do not hold to on your marks, set, and the gun to the point where you ask but if you're at the higher level rates, when we ask an athletes to be on their marks, then we tend to have them set up behind the line. And then when we say set, we ask the athletes to come up to the line, and then then the gun would go off on go, right? So for the 100, 200, 400, it would be take your marks, plural, set, and the gun. And for 800 and above, it would be take your marks and then the gun. Okay, overtaking rules for wheelchairs, there's a picture at the bottom. You cannot impede the athlete that you're overtaking. So you must make sure that your wheelchair is beyond the other wheelchair. You have position on a wheelchair in front of you when your front wheel is past the hub of the rear wheels of that wheelchair, right? So now you're in position, you have position, so that inside, well, in this case, if you were to, this athlete in lane 1 could not impede you if you were the second athlete here. Once your wheel has transitioned in front of that rear axle, okay? At that point in time, we would be watching for impeding of an athlete. For the passing athlete, it's the wheelchair that's passing has to be beyond the wheelchair and come in. For best practices purposes, if you're an athlete, in your mind, you should be 5 meters in front of that wheelchair before you decide you're going to slow down and pull in. Concentrate on going past them for at least 5 meters and then come in at full speed, and that'll do you well in racing. The starter has the ability in an 800-meter race to recall the race if there's a collision within the first 50 meters. Okay, for wheelchairs in the 800 meters, we start in lane for the first 100 or so meters. And then at the brake line, the rule is that the rear axle has to be beyond the brake point line. So in this case, he's in his lane and he's going forward. He's not disqualified. In the second picture here, he's past the brake line and he can cut in. And in the third case, that axle is behind the line. That athlete would be disqualified. The distance for best practices purposes, the distance from your lane, the shortest distance for the race from your lane would be from that break point to lane 1 of the 200 meters. So don't cut in at a left-hand angle. Work your way in, and that'll be your fastest path to the finish. The finish is the axle of the front wheel. I like to call it the Jesse Galley rule. In 2008 in Beijing, Jesse lost 800 meters by 1,000th of a second. And at that time, it was the hub of the wheel, and they made it smaller to be the axle of the wheel. I still think she won that race. Okay. All right. The frame runner the race runner has been renamed as a frame runner. So here is the definition of what a frame runner is and the rules that apply. The athlete would be standing and sitting on the rear seat and be leaning over the cushion here and holding onto the steering wheels to go. Okay, turn it over to you, Jer.
Thanks very much, Phil. Correct me if I'm wrong and feel free to comment as we go forward. Go ahead and kick the next slide, please. This is nothing really different than everybody is kind of used to. The time allocation for throws varies depending on how many you have in the event and at what time in the event. Seated throws doesn't change. It's a minute now. Remember, was it a year ago? They had changed it to 30 seconds and that wasn't working well. So it's now back to a minute. For the other events, it's 1 minute until you get down to the final person. You've got consecutive trials. It's 2 minutes. It's in the rule book, nothing to belabor. Go ahead, next slide. Guides for classes in T11 and 13. Okay, 2 guides for jumping events. A T11 athlete, who is the most severely affected athlete, gets 2 guides in the jumping events. However, in the throwing events, only gets 1 guide. In the jumping events, long jump, triple jump, you can have 1 guide orient the athlete on the runway, and you have another athlete down there near the pit, calling and vocalizing to help orient the guide as they run down the runway. In the throws, you have 1 guide. A guide can bring the athlete into the pit or into the circle, leave, and then go out in between the sector lines under the supervision of the officials and vocalize down there to help orient the athlete for their throw. For 12s, they only get 1 guide. The same rules apply. And as usual, T13s don't get guides. Next one. For the T11s and T12s, you can imagine it's kind of difficult to tell where the scratch line is if you can't see. Kind of obvious. So what we do is we put down a 1 meter patch of powder, white powder, often talcum powder or other substances. In desperation, you can use sand if you wish. So there are really kind of 3 instances where the foot plant for the jump will happen. If the foot plant goes over the scratch line, it's a foul just like everything else. If the foot plant is within the powder, and it is a legal jump, you measure from the closest point where their body lands in the sand to the toe of the footprint in the powder. Now, the strange question is, what if they jump well before the pit, the powder? Well, it's impossible to tell where that footprint might be because there's no powder there. So the standard operating procedure is you measure from the back line of that powder box. Pretty straightforward. Once you've done it once or twice, it goes quite well. Next one, please. And this is just another view of that same point. One point we want to make is for the visually impaired athletes, it's essential from a safety standpoint for the pit to be as wide as possible. Not all of those sand pits are this wide. 3.5 meters width is desired. You can imagine that an athlete running down there might get disoriented a little bit, and if it's a really narrow pit, they're going to wind up landing on the deck and injure themselves. So that's the point there. The takeoff board should be between 1 and 3 meters for the long jump. A point here is that some athletes, especially even in juniors, their capability or their qualification marks may be very close to where the takeoff board is. So we have the ability to recreate a takeoff board a little bit closer to the pit. It's a safety point. If you're looking at qualification marks, you can evaluate that ahead of time and decide, okay, for this event, we're going to have to move that board forward just because we don't want anybody landing on the edge of that pit. Next slide. Prosthetics, the 61s through 64s. They're not required for field events. And as Phil said just a little bit earlier, if you decide to use a prosthetic device in that event, you must continue to use it throughout the event. If the athlete loses their prosthesis during the run-up, they can't continue with it. It's not like we discussed earlier where you can grab your prosthesis on top. You can't do that. You can pause, put it back on and restart, but it must be all within that 1 minute time limit that you have to make the jump. If the prosthesis comes off after the takeoff and it lands in the pit behind the athlete, you measure to that mark that's made by the prosthesis that lands in the sand. If, however, the athlete jumps and the prosthesis comes off and lands on the deck, it's a foul every single time. It's pretty straightforward. Next slide, please. High jump. A little bit different. Athletes competing in the high jump can jump with or without prosthetics. If they are using the prosthesis, it's kind of like the long jump. If you lose it during the run-up, you can't continue. You have to put it back on and finish the run-up and jump within the 1 minute time limit you have, or whatever the time limit may be at that point in time. If the athlete makes the foot plant in an attempt to go over the bar and his or her prosthesis comes off, that has to go over the bar with the athlete. If it does not, it's a foul. Next slide. Seated throws. The bane of many official. Just like racing chairs, there are measurements. The maximum height of the seated throwing chair is 75 centimeters without the athlete in chair, and it includes the cushion. So if you got a big, thick cushion, measure to the top of the cushion. If it's too tall, it gives the athlete an advantage and could result in a slightly longer throw. And that's why we do that. The seat has to be no more than 30 centimeters on a side. That's actually fairly small. Most people make pretty big seats right now. One point here, that once you have examined the frame in the call room, so every time the athlete comes to an event, his chair gets looked at in the call room. Even if it's briefly, it gets evaluated. Once that frame has been inspected, it can't be taken from the competition venue because there is a possibility, excuse me, that someone could fiddle with the frame and make it illegal. Next slide. Okay, here's the seat. Yep. So 30 centimeters is 12 inches. That the 1 foot square is a pretty small seat. One other point is the seat must be preferably level. It can be inclined backwards, kind of that lounge chair effect, but it cannot lean forwards. So the back of the seat as you're facing the sector cannot be higher than the front. That's perceived as a potential advantage. You can cut the corners out to accommodate vertical bars for sides and backs on the throwing chair, and that's perfectly fine. You can cut slots in the seat as long as the seat is square or rectangular and within measurement, to allow you to take straps up and wrap them over your legs to keep you in a seated position, which we'll talk about again in a second. You can have back or side rests. Not quite finished with that slide. Back up, please. Thanks. You can have back or side rest. However, if you pad that side rest, you can't have more than 5 centimeters of padding on it, either the side or the back. The side rest can't be elastic or store energy, because that could be perceived as an assistance in the throw. It could be rigid. Most people use a canvas-like material for them. It allows them with some flexibility in their positioning. And obviously, no springs, movable joints, or anything like that in the throwing chair. Okay, now next slide. Again, chair cannot be round, or can be rectangular or square within the measurements. You see in this slide, that is a vertical bar. We don't call it holding bar anymore. We call it a vertical bar because some people protest at that point, at some point. But you can add an angular piece to support that vertical bar to prevent it from flexing, because the rule indicates that that vertical bar, if you're hanging on to it during the throw, cannot flex. If it flexes, it stores energy and helps pull the athlete going forward and can facilitate the throw, especially if the athlete is one of those classes that doesn't have much trunk. It can be a significant advantage. So that's the point here. You can put tape on the bar. That's not restricted to any particular class, to make the bar less slippery and give you a better grip. However, if the lower level classes, the less functional classes, the 31s through 33s, the 51s through 53s, so the lower level CPs and the lower level wheelchair race athletes, they can tape, they can wear a glove, and they can also tape or strap their hand to the vertical bar, as you can see that picture on the left. That's perfectly legal, but only for those classes. If you were to have, like, say, an F54 athlete come in and pull a glove on and start to grab the bar, that would be illegal, and it would be up to the official to stop that if caught in advance. Taping and strapping. Seated throws occurs in 3 different stages. Number 1, you bring the chair in, and the chair along with the team that's working the pit facilitates hooking that chair up and tying it to the ground so the chair doesn't move during the athlete's use during competition. Once that is done, the official will offer that chair to the athlete, and then that athlete can get into the chair, and he has a varied amount of time to strap themselves in and do as many warm-up throws as they want within the time limit allowed. And I'll show you the time limits in a second. For taping, and then of course the third point is that then you move on to the competitive throwing. Taping, you can't tape your fingers together. That's been around in the rules for a long time. Just to reiterate that that's illegal. You can have tape on your fingers. The classes 51, 2, and 3 can tape their non-throwing hand to the holding bar, like we just said. You have to be able to move your fingers. So if you have somebody with tape, inspect it, make sure that their fingers can move independently and they're not strapped together, so it gives them a better purchase on the implement. Request for assistance. Request for assistance for the lower functioning classes 32 through 34 and 51 through 54 is not required. They have permission to bring one assistant out with them to help make the transfer into the throwing chair. and perhaps to help them strap if they need assistance with strapping. The team should allow that individual to come out. One important point that Phil mentioned a little bit earlier is that you're not allowed to coach. Half the time, the assistant that comes out with the athlete is a coach, and it's really hard for them to not sit there to tell them what to do and remind them to do things. If you catch them, warn them. If they continue to do that, you can ask them to leave. Next slide, please.
I just want to make one comment. You know, in the United States, we're trying to meet the level of this rule for the 55s through 57s to be able to get into the chair themselves, and then also to strap themselves in themselves. So we're for the U14 athletes, we still allow those athletes to have a coach or an assistant come in to help them. And for the U17 and older, you know, it's a work in progress. So we're still working with our coaches and our athletes to get them to do this, because if you do go on to international competition, it will become a rule and you cannot work around the rule. Our biggest issue here is feet, right? So hands and keeping your upper body strapped in, pretty easy for 55 through 57. It's the being able to lean over and do your feet. For our professional athletes, they have chairs that are their own and they've worked it out. For our community athletes, we're sharing chairs. It's a bigger problem.
Most certainly. We strongly encourage the coaches that are online here with us to include having the athlete, if they're the appropriate class, to learn how to strap themselves in and do it for themselves. Because as Phil said, as they move up in stature and age and maybe begin to competing in bigger events, it's going to be important that they know how to do that themselves, including the transfers. Chair position in the ring. No part of the chair can extend over the imaginary vertical plane of the circle. This means foot plates, heads of screws, parts of the frame, anything, nothing of that can stick out beyond that circle towards the sector. However, if, say, imagine the foot plate is well behind and inside the circle, and the athlete has big feet, he's got his big old toes sticking out over that imaginary line, that is okay. That's his body part, not the frame, but the frame has to stay inside the circle. We use ratchet straps and chains. This is not new to most of you, I'm sure. Chains are being seen a lot more these days, especially for the bigger athletes, the big, strong guys and women. The chains have less flex and really help to hold the athletes down. So it might be something you could consider utilizing for your athlete. One point here is if during the throw that the athlete touches one of the straps that's holding them down, holding the field chair down to the platform, outside that imaginary vertical plane, then that would be a foul. Another point here that's not on the slide, sometimes the straps break, right? If it's a strap that's holding the chair down to the platform, that's the responsibility of the officials and the team they have working with them to make sure that the chair is appropriately strapped down to the platform. If it should break, the athlete has an option to have another throw, or if for some reason they really like the flow and want to keep it, that's perfectly fine with us. And then you fix the straps and let them continue the competition. If, however, the athlete's straps, which are holding them into the chair, should break, those straps are entirely the responsibility of the athlete. And if they break, it's his or her responsibility to fix them. And if it's a bad throw, it's a bad throw. They have no recourse. So to repeat, the straps holding the chair to the platform are our responsibility as officials. The straps tying the athlete to the chair are the responsibility of the athlete. And another particular point, the athlete has to bring their own straps. We don't bring straps. We don't have straps in the pit. So they need to be responsible for that. Now on to preparing for throws, the time allocations. You can see in this slide, there's a 4-minute and a 5-minute time slot. So once the chair is strapped down and the official says, athlete, get in your chair, it's yours. The athlete then either has 4 or 5 minutes to get into the chair, strap themselves in, and take as many warm-up throws as they wish. They don't have to take those warm-up throws, but they have that amount of time. The more functionally impaired athletes, the F31s and the 51s through 53s, have a longer period of time to get this accomplished. That's the 5-minute rule. Everybody else gets 4 minutes. It's an easy way to remember. If you remember 31, 51, 2, and 3 for 5 minutes, it's easy to remember that everybody else gets 4. Now there is a rule that's kind of unique. Oftentimes what we'll do is we'll get an athlete into the chair and we're gonna let them throw 6 straight throws and mark them out there with little wire marking flags. And if, however, the competition, say, has more than eight individuals in it, the number of lanes on the track, then they're going to have to whittle that down to the final 8. So what they'll do, which has been around forever, is you'll do 3 throws, get it down to 8, and then they'll do the second round. If that happens to occur in 2 pools, the second set of 3 throws, these individuals, the more functionally impaired individuals, get 3 minutes to do their strap in, and everybody else gets 2 minutes, and there are no warm-ups for that second round of 3. That's important to remember. And for the adapted track and field USA exceptions for the youth, the U7s, 11s, and 14s, one warm-up is offered if the athlete runs out of time to get themselves strapped in and get a warm-up in. But that's, again, only for the juniors here in the United States.
Right. And just a comment, typically we run into that problem because the coach isn't ready and not that the athlete isn't ready. So coaches, make sure that your chair is set up properly when we come in, because we don't have a lot of time to do that. There's also best practices here. So if you're an official and you're running, or a meet organizer and you're running an event, if you've got 9 or 10 seated throwers in one class and you're using one pit, the best practices would be to allow all 10 athletes or 11 or 12 athletes to throw all 6 implements at one time and determine a winner, rather than go to 3 and 3. The reason for that is it's going to take less time. So if you don't have usually you're doing a 1-day meet, and so typically that will be less time if you just let them throw the 6 rather than having to move those chairs in and out twice during the time frame. But if you're
wholeheartedly agree.
right,
Yeah, one other point too is when these coaches come in to assist in getting the athletes strapped down in these events, no coaching is allowed. So, a parent or a coach comes in to help strap one of our junior athletes in the chair, they can't start telling them how to throw and remind them what to do and how their normal throwing routine is. They can help strap, and then they are asked to remove themselves and let the athlete throw.
right. And then our regional meets, we won't necessarily ask you to fill out the paperwork for assistance. You can go to the chief judge in the pit and work it out with them.
Better for us.
Yeah, and best practices, again, if you're an official, is and you haven't done this before, you should ask the people that are in your pit who, in the United States, if we're running a meet in the United States, ask who's sharing a chair, group those athletes together, don't follow the way they are on the heat sheet, so that you only bring the chair in once, you use it for 2 or 3 athletes before you change it. Again, we'll save a lot of time.
Amen. Lifting, the bane of every official in seated throws. F31s through 34s and 51s through 57s. We're going to try and press on real quick. Basically, next slide. Can you give me the next slide real quick?
Yeah.
Okay. This is a diagram of a seated athlete. That gray area on the bottom is the cushion of the throwing chair. You can see what's called the ischial tuberosity where that red arrow is. Once the athlete is given the implement and has it in their hand until the implement has landed out in between the sector lines, that ischial tuberosity and going forward all the way to the back of the knee must remain in contact with that cushion at the top of the chair. That's lifting. And the rationale is basically, used to be some people had the capacity to stand up a little bit and it gave them an advantage. Now we just force everybody to remain seated. And that's the bottom line for the lifting rule. A quick and easy way to tell where the ischial tuberosity is, once they get seated and kind of strapped into their chair, if possible, ask the athlete to lay all the way forward on their knees. And if you look all the way back at the rear where it's touching, that's kind of probably be roughly close to where the ischial tuberosity is. The fleshy part of the buttock behind that, if you see that come up as the athlete throws, that's not lifting. It's only if that part of the butt where the bone is, if that comes all the way up off the ground, that's lifting and it's a foul. Next slide. Chair tie downs, we went over this already. If the tie down to the platform breaks, it's our fault. If it's the athlete's fault if the strap holding them onto the chair fails. Loose clothing. This refers to the idea that if somebody has really baggy pants on, it's very difficult to tell whether or not their rear end comes up off the seat. So you can tape it, or you, if caught early enough, they could change pants. But you have the right to ask to do something about that, so you can make a call. Normal rules apply to substances used on field implements. However, they have to be water soluble, and there are plenty of things that you can buy on the market now that are water soluble. None of the old stuff, because it gets so sticky and you can't get it off. Next slide. Here's an example on the left here of tape wrapped around a vertical bar, not the holding bar. That's perfectly allowed. Gives a little bit of a ball there to provide for grip. You can see again, there's a slot in that one chair there. It looks pretty legal, and they're just using that to strap around one limb. One point about lifting, if it's an amputee, the remnant of their leg still must remain on there. So you can see that perhaps this chair was used for an amputee to keep that remnant leg on there. And you can see all the way over to the right, you can see that angled bar with the tape wrapped around it. That's supporting that vertical bar so it doesn't flex and store energy and aid the athlete. Next, please. Measuring the number of attempts seated. Typically at the bigger competitions like Paralympics and World Championships, regional events like the Pan American Games, we'll try to do first 3 rounds, get it down to 8, and then we'll move forward with the final 8. If it's done in 2 or more pools, so there are quite a few athletes, then the second 3 should be done in reverse order. It's only under those conditions do we reverse the order in seated throws. All other meets, you can use the method described for 6 consecutive throws. We highly recommend doing that when you can, using the flags, number the flags so you know what throw came first and which came last. That's our best practice. You really don't want to have to be running that steel tape underneath the chair to try and line it up with the center of that circle and doing that. Get them to throw all 6, take the chair out of the way, and then do your measurements if you can. Javelin has to land tip first. I reiterate, the tip of the javelin must hit the ground tip first to be legal. If it lands and hits the rope in the middle of the javelin, it doesn't count. However, for our juniors, we U11s and U14s, we do mark whatever part of the javelin hits the ground first. If it's the rope, It's the back of the rope closest to the athlete. Any comments on that, Phil?
No, that's good.
Okay, next slide, please. Oh, checking for the implement weight. Oh, I've seen this and had it happen to me too many times to count. The point is the diameter of things in the shot put is the classic example. The diameter of a 3K and the diameter of a 4K can be exactly the same size. And there's not a huge amount of weight difference to it. So you look at them, they're the same color. It's easy to make a mistake. So what we do and what will happen at major competitions, and we try to do it at our smaller competitions, is we document the weight that the athlete is supposed to be throwing. A good rule of thumb is to check and make sure the athlete is throwing the correct one, because if not, you're all done and you suddenly realize, oh no, they threw the wrong weight implement, and you have to go back and do it all over again. So, but we try to eliminate that. Also, typically when implements are checked in, and of course when the LOC is providing implements, we number them. So good practice is to write down on the flight sheet the number of the implement, the little serial number that we put on there. So if anything goes wrong or you need to deal with something for a record, you know which one it is and can take care of things a lot easier. For those of you who've been doing this for a while, this next to last bullet makes a lot of sense and you already know about it. But the 0 point on these measuring tapes is in all different places. So it's really important to make sure you're using the right end of the tape to make your measurements. Pull the tape through the center of a circle. The tape has to be straight in a straight line, pulled tight, those kinds of things. It used to be in England, there was a tension measurement that you could make to pull the tape, but that's been a while. World records. If it is a world record or a regional record, that means the Americas, the Asians, the Europeans, etc. 3 judges have to sign the world record form. They have to visually confirm the reading. So it's not just that they have to sign it, 3 people have to come up and look at that measurement and confirm that the measurement is, and agree on that measurement. Once you're sure that it's a world record, you impound the implement immediately, take it back and have it reweighed and measured, make sure that the implement hasn't been damaged or anything that might cause any kind of an advantage. For Adaptive Track and Field USA, we require only a minimum of 2 judges reviewing the measurement and signing it. And then the referee, of course, always has to sign. And even in Adaptive Track and Field USA, the implement must be reweighed. More often than not, we'll reweigh it because we know what the serial number was used to do it after the event is over. In all cases, you got to use a steel tape or a laser for a record measurement. More often than not, you'll have a fiberglass tape out there. You should have a steel tape kind of floating around the competition to be able to use. I don't recommend using steel tapes on every throw unless you probably have an athlete you know is going to break a record, and then it probably makes sense to do that. They're expensive and easily damaged. And here's the test.
That's it. So
if you guys have any questions, please.
yeah, if you have any questions, we have about a minute and a half. So if you are, you could take the test whether you're an official, a USATF official or not. If you're not a USATF association level or higher, we'll know that you passed the test and we can use you as a volunteer. But if you are that level or higher, then the process will be take the test. You'll get verification immediately that you passed it. If you did not pass it, someone will write you an email to tell you to take the test again. And then from that point in time, your name and information will go up onto our database. And again, on Adaptive Track and Field USA, in the officials corner, there's an application called Find an Official. You put in, if you're a meet organizer, you put in a zip code of where the meet is. It will show you all the officials that have passed the test from the closest to the furthest away, and you can get in touch with them. The information also goes to USATF, and they will then notify it'll go up on the new database that you've passed, and they'll also notify your association that you've passed the test.
One point here, we talked about assistance, and it's really difficult to kind of remember what class is allowed to do what when they're in the competition area. There's a cheat sheet now available on, is it the track and field, adaptive track and field website, Phil?
Yeah.
Phil just put that up today. I'd highly recommend downloading it and kind of keep it folded up in your pocket when you go to do these events. I look at mine all the time, so.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. I don't think we have any, if we have any questions, we have about a minute left. So if you want, otherwise, I know, Phil, your contact information is on the rule book, correct?
Correct. It's there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, both of you. It was a great session. We had great numbers, and looking forward when we can all be live at our meets versus virtual. So thank both of you, and all the rules again are on the website. So
Thank you.
all right.
Hopefully see everybody out competing soon.
Absolutely.
Keep our
Thank you.
fingers crossed.
All right, thanks, guys. Appreciate. Oh, there's one question. Hold on, quickly.
Okay.
Will you send us that link to take the test?
Oh, it's a, well, you go to, when you do, go to adaptivetrackandfieldusa.org, go to the officials corner. On the page that comes up, it'll show you the course. This course will come up, and then right here on the test, you just hit this link and it'll go right to the test.
Okay.
So the link is in the test.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, everyone. Thanks so much. And we're signing off.
See everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.